I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You are the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Try that again. Welcome to Life Today Live. Great to have you here today. And we're heading into the election, and so we're going to hit some of the issues and our approach to the election. So again, from my friends outside the United States, just bear with me on these. But there was recently an organization I saw called Evangelicals for Harris, and I joked, I guess Evangelicals for Transgenderism was already taken, or Evangelicals for Abortion already taken. I don't know. And it just seemed, just because of the direction of the platform of the Democrat Party, it just seemed really off to me. It's like, I'm going to stand for everything that I stand against, But let me ask you this question. Is Evangelicals for Trump really any more proper? I mean, it makes more sense, even though we have some issues we definitely disagree with President Trump. Is that really the right approach? How should we approach politics? How should we maintain Christ at the center while discussing something so divisive? We're going to talk about that today, and hopefully give you a little direction that'll help you better navigate this political season and future ones. My guest today has a book out called Serpents and Doves, and that is written by Dr. James Spencer. He is currently the president of the D.L. Moody Center, and he serves as a managing partner of an organization called Useful to God, which we'll tell you about a little bit later. But he joins me to give me some of his thoughts on how we can be good Christians in a political season, which can be a bit of a challenge if we're honest. Dr. Spencer, welcome to Life Today Live. Great to have you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
So, they tell us two things you don't talk about, politics and religion, and you dove right in. Why are you going this direction?
I started writing about politics and the intersection of Christianity and politics in 2022. And before that, I really wasn't too interested in politics. But what I began to see at, sort of toward the end of 2022 was that politics started to captivate evangelical imagination in ways that I hadn't seen it before. And so my real concern was, what does the church do as we're seeking to be and make disciples for Jesus Christ? How do we go about attending to the politics of the day? And how is that perhaps distracting us from our more central mission of being and making disciples? Mm-hmm. And so the goal has never been to mobilize people to political action, nor to tell Christians they shouldn't participate politically at all. It's been more about, how do we keep Christ in the center? How do we go about doing this as Christians so that while we're participating in politics, we're clearly pointing to and glorifying the triune God?
So as you talk about this, write about this, host the Thinking Christian podcast, you say you're not wanting to necessarily motivate people to political action. Let me ask you this. As a Christian, should we be involved in politics?
I think it's up to individual Christians. Like we talked a little bit before the show, and I said that my wife and I were adopting. Now, I think adoption is a great thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's something that is certainly a way for us to demonstrate our faith in the world. Do I think that everyone should adopt? No. I don't think it's a mandate for every Christian to adopt. I just don't. And I would say something similar with politics. I think politics can be a very good way for us to demonstrate our love for God, demonstrate our love for neighbor. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to say that it's mandated for all Christians to participate in politics in specific ways. These are rights that we've been given within the United States, and so it's certainly appropriate for us to think about how we go about exercising them, how we go about interacting with the system, and which is governed by the people, for the people, and of the people, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that we have to do that. I think our calling is still a step above just diving into the political realm and trying to fix what's wrong with America. I think our call is to be all things to all people that we might save some. And so we've got to do the calculations on this and decide, in my conscience, do I feel it's appropriate in order for me to reach the people around me, reach my local area? Is it appropriate for me to participate in politics? And if so, how?
Yeah, and I would agree that it's not like you don't prove or disprove your Christianity or your faith by whether or not you vote. And certainly not everyone's called into politics. I'm not, right? I'm not running for office. I don't have any plans to. I've said too many things on this program that would get me in trouble, you know. So, and I'm good with that. I frankly, I don't know that I'd want to. But my concern is if you let people off the hook from at least voting, which is having some input, having some influence. We know that massive amount of Christians don't vote. And to me, that just says, let's let the unrighteous, right? Those who don't know God, those who the Bible would say don't know right from wrong. You know, if you're not a Christian, you live in a state of iniquity. We're just letting them rule over us, which just seems foolish. How do you address that?
I think there's a couple of ways to do it. Number one, I don't want to say that we shouldn't participate at all.
Yeah.
I think that the way I think about Christian community, I like to think of it like it's a dam holding back water.
Yeah, right.
If you think about what a dam does, it's always in contact with the water. It's in contact with this body of water that is pressuring it to cave in on itself. But the contact is always there. And so we're never isolated from the world. We never lose contact with the world. We are always in the fray, so to speak. But what we're trying to do is hold our shape.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes what I'm more concerned to do is not to say, hey, don't vote, hey, don't participate politically. It's more to resituate this and say, where is our hope really? I think that there's a problem on the other side of the spectrum right now where we're looking at this and we're saying, if X person doesn't get into office, and you mentioned in the intro evangelicals for Trump or evangelicals for Harris, and then there's also a lot of evangelicals for Trump. Mm-hmm. And I think the challenge is, how do we get people to stop looking at that and saying, if Trump doesn't get elected or if Harris doesn't get elected,
right.
Life is over as I know it.
Right.
Versus looking at it and saying, God has his hand on this. There's not very many Israelites that would have voted for Nebuchadnezzar. And yet he was God's servant to bring about redemption and a sifting of Israel, right? There were probably more Israelites who would have voted for Cyrus, who sent them back into the land. Mm-hmm. But in both of those cases, these are God's servants. And so sometimes we just have to not detach and stop participating, but recognize that what we're doing, what we're seeing, isn't all that God is seeing, isn't all that God is doing.
Right. I'm with you on that because honestly, if we're really honest, a lot of Christians use voting as an excuse not to evangelize. You know, it's like, well, if I can get this guy elected, well, then I'm good. I don't have to talk to my neighbor about Jesus. And it's like, let's not go that direction. You know, there's an old hider saying, for every mile of road, there's 2 miles of ditch, right? And it's really, I do think that just stepping back saying politics is dirty, I need to stay away from it. It's like, that's one ditch. And then the other is saying that, oh, yes, and we've heard it. I mean, I don't have any restrictions here. I can say it. That Trump is God's man. Like, don't. I pray for him, just like I would pray for Kamala Harris, but sure. Let's be realistic here. Trump has his flaws. It's just I can work with his a little better than I can work with the others, and from a political standpoint, that's where I would go. But I don't know. It's a tough one, I think, to walk sometimes.
Yeah.
What do you not like about the idea of Trump of evangelicals for Trump?
I think what I'm pushing against there, right, is evangelicals for anyone.
Yeah.
I think evangelicals should be for Christ, and that when we lose focus on that, we are going to make some mistakes.
Yeah.
So there's something about, I've said this before, but conservatism can't encapsulate Christianity. Christianity has a surplus from conservatism. It's Christ. Conservatives and Christians can agree on a lot of things, but we will never agree on Christ. And so what we have to do is recognize that no matter who gets elected, what kind of moral society we're living in, it's only ever going to be a semblance of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
It's only going to get us somewhat closer to that. And that's okay. I think we do need to be moving closer to that, right? We don't want to just vote in evil and do crazy things. But what we need to recognize is that we are the only people who realize this is only a semblance. We're the only people who know the actual answer. And so we can't keep surrendering our proclamation of Jesus as Lord in order to win on the political side. We're shorting it. And so to me, what we have is the rest of the story, kind of a nod to Paul Harvey, I suppose, right? And we need to be telling the rest of the story. We need to make sure that we're not shorting our message and just saying, no, we want these conservative values. We want this person in office. We want this sort of political arrangement. Because at the end of the day, Jesus is Lord is a very political statement that we need to be proclaiming from the rooftops. That's the sort of orientation I'm trying to push us toward, a much more theologically rooted understanding of our political participation and how the Christian message has a surplus of any political platform we could ever look at.
So what do you look at? Because it's funny and it's nothing new. I mean, if you study any history, you look back and you see how both sides demonize the other side personally. And I look at it and go, look, people come and go, candidates come and go. It's the policies, the platforms, those things we live with for, ever or decades or at least a long time. And so I always, when people are like, I don't like Trump, I go, yeah, okay, 4 years and he's done, right? If he wins, or Harris, 4 years and she's done if she wins. So either way, they're going to be out. But what will we be left with? How important? What do you think? I'm kind of answering your question for you. How important is it, right? But what do you think of when you just look at the policies? Because those are the things I really am concerned with.
Well, I'll say this has been sort of an evolution in my thinking. I think initially when I dove into this, I was a little bit too strongly, it's theology or nothing, right? Which, given my background, makes some sense.
Right. You can be forgiven.
I'm a theology geek. And so, if it's not theological, it doesn't make sense. We should try to stay away from it. But I think that as I've read more and thought more and interacted with people who are really involved in the political space, which I've been grateful for, what I've realized is that what we're looking to do is move our nation toward some sort of good. Now, if we're out in the public and we say, hey, what's good about the world? We're going to get a million different answers. As Christians, we have a unique position with which we can answer that question. We can move people toward a common good because we understand what the common good actually is. And so I think that we have, when I'm participating politically, when I'm looking at who to vote for, when I'm considering, all of those different things that we could do in the world, I think I am looking at those policies and procedures and platforms and saying, what seems most reasonable to move the world toward the public good? What does that look like? And so I think that's the appropriate way to look at it. That's definitely what I've come to, is recognizing that we are only going to get a semblance, but that there are some political systems, political ideologies, policies of those kind of sorts that will actually make us sicker as opposed to getting us better.
Yeah. And okay. So there's another thing. You can look at platforms. You can listen to what candidates say. And usually they say things that sound good, usually. And this is true for both of them. But when you look at, let's just take something like, solving poverty, right? I think most of us would agree that poverty is not good, or homelessness, things like this.
Right.
But how do you do it? And oftentimes that I think we need to look at the past to understand where we should go in the future. And again, this is true for both, whatever issue you want, both parties. How important is it we not just listen to the promises or the words or the slogans and go, how has that worked in the past?
Yeah. I'd say two things about this. Number one, when I think about the political realm, I kind of think of it as a game of Monopoly. And it doesn't matter whether you're the car or the thimble or the purse, you're still playing Monopoly. And so the strategies you employ when you're playing Monopoly are going to be fairly limited. You can choose to get the light blue properties on the front end that are pretty cheap and you can get hotels on fast, or you can hold out for Boardwalk and Park Place, right? But you have a limited range of strategies. This is the political realm. And so as the candidates are, sort of posturing and giving us their ideas, what you realize is they're playing Monopoly, right? And if we just stay on that Monopoly board, I think we're not going to get as much done. And so if I were looking historically and asking the question, how do we address something like poverty? I'm also looking at Christian organizations, nonprofit organizations that have plugged in and actually helped, been boots on the ground,
Right.
actually helping people in poverty. I'm not looking just at the government.
Yeah.
And I think that has to be part of our lens here. You know, when we look at what a presidential candidate is actually saying, we have to also sort of baptize that within the reality of, is that even in the role of the president?
Yeah.
Could this person actually accomplish this?
Right.
And when you look at something like solving poverty, which is a big, complex issue, maybe what we want is a president who's going to help coordinate some of these things. But we shouldn't be looking at one person or a set of policies, even, I don't think, that are going to eradicate that poverty. That is a complex problem. We need complex solution. And anybody who's telling us that it's a simple solution is just lying to us.
That's so true, and that again, that cuts both ways.
It does.
Yeah, it does. One thing I have noticed, I'm old enough and I've been around, seen a few things, as we've done work, even around the world, and feeding people, getting them clean water, and things like that. Some disaster relief, things like that. And, FEMA's come under fire after the hurricanes down in Florida, and I just. Most of these people are really good people, really doing really hard work. What I've discovered, though, is that the people that are better at it are the people that are closer to it. And so when you get these federal bureaucracies, they can do some good. Yes, usually it's with the purse strings, but yes, they can do some things. But it's always the locals, the closer you get, because you need this. You need like this human connection. And so your point about looking at, the nonprofit groups, and historically the church has done so much of this.
Right.
Actually, that's part of my concern with the Democrats right now is when they start telling, the Catholic charities, well, you can't adopt out children if you don't change, what amounts to a theological position, And so I really think the solution is more with the people, which to me turns around and points right back at the church and saying, look, you need to get back to the core gospel of helping the poor, helping the orphans and the widows. And don't, when Paul went to validate the gospel he was preaching, this, with the apostles, they said, oh, yeah, one more thing. You know what this is?
Yeah, care for the poor. All we ask is that you take care of the poor.
I mean, that to me is almost crazy that you go, let's talk about the fundamentals of the gospel and add one more thing. Okay, well, you want to be on safe ground, care for the poor. I am not one of those guys that likes to just talk about the failure of the church, but I do think that if we would stick with the really basics of the gospel, we could be more effective. How much of this is on us?
So I agree. I don't think we want to talk about the failure of the church. I think what I've seen just in working in New England, so I'm with the DL Moody Center, we work a lot in New England. And when you hear about New England and New England churches, you generally don't think good things. It's a very difficult area to do ministry. But what we found as I interacted with these churches, at least, what I saw was a lot of faithful, embattled churches and pastors just doing the good work of the gospel. They're not bearing huge fruit. They're not building big ministries. They don't have flash. They don't have podcasts. They don't have national radio programs. They don't have anything like that.
Yeah.
But they are doing the hard boots on the ground work of the gospel. And so I just throw that in there to say, even as we look at the broader scope of the church and what it might do better, I think there are still those sort of unsung heroes among us who are doing this hard work.
Oh, gosh.
And so what I would say is, I think much of what's been promoted within evangelicalism particularly has been a politically slanted sort of church. And we get this particularly around the political time. I mean, ex-evangelicals are reacting to this. They're frustrated that evangelicals are so tied into particularly conservative, usually Republican positions. And I think that creates a problem for the church's witness. And I think it's a problem simply because you're only promoting that. And we're missing out on all of these other amazing things the church could be doing. Now, in addition to that, what I would just say is, yeah, I think churches do need to tie into their communities more tightly.
Yes.
I think there has to be a godly presence in a local community, because that's where it's going to be seen and felt the most.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can counteract a lot of the scandals that we see of pastors who are falling more morally, or some of the things that people might deem a little crazy when you're looking at even evangelicals for Harris or evangelicals for Trump or what have you. We can counteract a lot of that just by being salt and light in the moment, in our area, in our local communities.
I couldn't agree more. I really, we have to get to that. All right, I want you to explain the title of your book, Serpents and Doves. I think
Sure.
I get it, but let's hear it from you.
I actually had Pastor Lutzer, Dr. Erwin Lutzer. He said I should have titled the book something different because it was confusing. So he was right. But Serpents and Doves refers to Matthew 10. And it's when Jesus sends his disciples out for the first time, and he's sending them to the lost sheep of Israel. And he tells them that they're going to have to be, wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And he tells them that because the people who do not accept the gospel, the people who reject the message that they're bringing, are going to end up betraying them. And so what he wants to make sure of is that they are being wise in depending on those who accept the gospel message, and not necessarily rejecting, but certainly recognizing that some of their friends are going to end up being a little bit of false friends, that they're ultimately going to betray because they're not headed in the same direction as the disciples. And so the reason I titled the book that is that the political realm is inherently somewhere where we have to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, because we know that the U.S. government and really any political actors who aren't Christians don't have a vested interest in making disciples for Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And because that's what we're doing, we can always expect at some point that there's going to be heavy friction between the two of us.
We're at that point.
Yeah, it sure feels like it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and I think, the goal is just to say we can't depend on the government to build the church.
Right.
Because they won't.
Yeah. Well,
and that's our job.
So, okay, we hear a lot about separation of church and state. Now, I know you know this, but for some people
Sure.
that may not know this, that whole idea, one, is not in the Constitution. It's not like a law or anything. That comes from a letter from, what was it, Thomas Jefferson?
Jefferson.
Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist. And it was the Baptist, it was the church saying, hey, will you make sure that the government, doesn't encroach on what is the church's territory? It was about keeping the government out of church, and yet we flipped this thing to say that it's more about keeping the church out of government. At the same time, given where most of the early settlers came over from Europe, the European ones anyway, they were escaping places where church and state were the same thing. In other words, whoever was head of the state was also head of the church. And you can look, look, I got an Ireland shirt on, right? You can look back in the history of Ireland and England and see France
Right.
and see what a mess that is. I don't want Trump being the head of the church. Sure as heck don't want Harris being head of the church. How critical is it that we respect, but in the right way, that separation?
I think it's pretty crucial. I think that what I would argue is that in our political participation, sometimes we're allowing the sort of nose of the camel to come into the tent. We're allowing politics into the church simply by the way that we are participating in politics. In other words, the government doesn't have to be coercive. It doesn't have to come in and tell churches what they have to do or manage their theology or, manage their religion.
Right.
In order for it to have a negative influence on what's happening in the church. It can actually just happen by the fact that we are paying so much attention to the political realm that Christ is pushed off to the side. He becomes less foregrounded and more backgrounded in all of our conversations. Mm-hmm. But I do absolutely agree that I think what we need to do is, number one, we need to view politics as sacred. And I know that'll sound a little strange, but when we had, a political authority over the church as well, it was clear that politics were supposed to be sacred, that the political leader had a particular station over us. Now we tend to view politics as just straight secular, and that's not quite what it is. All of God's creation participates in the sacred realm. Everything we see around us is sacred in some sense. And so it's appropriate for us to lean into politics. It's appropriate for us to understand what's going on there and participate in certain ways. But we also have to recognize that the church stands on its, not on its own, but on God's word. It is determined not by, us. Like, we don't have votes about what our theology should be, right? The theology is embedded within Scripture. It's been revealed to us. It's determined by God. And so the church is not an entity that is a volunteer society that we can opt into and opt out of. It's just determined. And that's why ultimately, as we look at the separation of church and state, it's obvious that the state can't tell the church what it is supposed to be, because God's already done that.
Yeah.
And so any change that the state would try to make are going to turn us into a community that we're really not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see some influence that way, and a little concerning. All right, I want to show people a website. This is the website, usefultogod.com. And you can read some of Dr. Spencer's work, as well as connect to the Thinking Christian podcast. You hit the dicey issues here. Right there on the top, there's a thing about critical race theory, right? What's your approach? Because this is, I think, where a lot of Christians, they don't want to talk about it because they don't have confidence, or they don't want to talk about it because they know it's divisive, or they kind of freak out because they're like, I don't know if I can talk. I know the person disagrees with me. I don't think I can even have a conversation with them, and I think that's an unhealthy approach. How do you talk to people about these ideas that you either disagree with or you're not sure you agree with?
Yeah, I try to approach every conversation with just three ideas in mind. I want to be calm, I want to be thoughtful, and I want to be theological. And the calm is just, I'm not going to get offended. It's just someone's thought process. It's just what someone thinks. And so if I'm sitting across the table from someone and I'm a Christian, what I'm trying to do is deeply understand them, because what I really want to have them do is accept Christ as their Savior. I don't need to get mad. I don't need to prove my point. I don't need to be right. I just need to be calm and listen and understand what they're saying. That does not mean that I won't be critical. It doesn't mean that I'll agree with everything they say, or even ask others to agree with everything they say, but I need to be calm, because at the end of the day, I'm in no danger. They're just words. They're just thoughts. And so we can evaluate those words and those thoughts without going, crazy town and trying to, call these the new heresies or what have you.
Yeah, right.
It's appropriate for us to evaluate them. It's appropriate for us to think about them, and it's appropriate for us to think, I think, particularly theologically about them, understanding how they misrepresent God, us, and the world.
Yeah.
But all of that can be done in a fairly calm fashion.
It should be.
So that's just how I approach those.
I think you may have stumbled upon something. Trump's ideas we call Trumpisms. Maybe Harris's ideas we call heresies. I don't. I'm sorry. The low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
No. So I had a good serious question, and my own joke just threw me off track. What was I going to ask you? I completely lost the thread. It happens. Oh, yeah, no, it was. So you got that book behind you, Christian Resistance.
Yes.
Book cover in the frame. And I love the idea, because you talk about offense. This is where I was going. The thing about the Bible literally says don't take offense. And here's the thing. You and I know that there's tons of things that are offensive in this world. There are things that are offensive to God.
Oh, yeah.
But offense is a two-part transaction. One person gives it, and another person has to take it. And when I realized that, I went, wait a minute. People can be offensive all day long. They say offensive things, whatever. You name it. But I don't have to pick it up and take it and carry it around and let it affect me. I mean, seriously, once I realized that, which sounds very simple, but to me it was profound, because it was like, okay, yeah, I see all your offense that you're dishing out, but I'm not going to pick it up. And I think that's where a lot of Christians get hung up, because these ideas are offensive. Some of these policies are offensive. There's certainly things people, Trump says offensive things all the time. And that's where a lot of people run with that, How do you confront offensive ideas and offensive people without taking on the offense?
Yeah, so you referenced Christian resistance in the background there. And I would say at the heart of Christian resistance is learning not to love the world on the world's terms.
What does
So
that
what
mean?
we want to do is we want to love the world but on God's terms.
Huh.
And so as we're approaching these things, as we're hearing things that would ordinarily be offensive, we need to be recalibrating, reorienting ourselves and saying, I should be really curious about why somebody believes this. I should be compassionate that they have no other framework,
Right.
that they don't have Christ in their life to understand this differently. And thus, I'm not angry. I'm not upset. I'm not defensive. I'm simply now curious and compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think when I say that, people wonder, well, what happens when they're trying to force those views on you? My tendency is to think, especially in the United States, that we have a legal system, we have political, mechanisms that we can use and is appropriate for Christians to use. I think a lot of the Christian lawsuits we've seen, coaches praying, cake bakers, all those kind of things, those are appropriate suits to bring. They allow us to be adjudicated by our peers. And so I think there are mechanisms that we can calmly use as we go through this.
Mm-hmm.
And at those points where ultimately we lose, the government decides, hey, we are going to coerce you into doing this, that's where we tend to accept suffering for doing good.
Hmm.
And that is the last recourse, really, I think, of the church, is to suffer for doing good. We never abandon our convictions, but there's no sense in which we need to portray as if having our freedoms preserved is our utmost priority, because our utmost priority is always having people come back into the kingdom with us. Our goal is to help people live under the authority of Jesus Christ. The first step of that is to accept Jesus Christ as Lord. Mm-hmm. And so when I get mad or frustrated or agitated about some policy or issue, that's just my initial reaction usually. Mm-hmm. And I've had to learn to really take a step back, breathe a little bit, and say, how does this anger accomplish anything other than me feeling a little bit better about my life and getting to vent my frustration? It doesn't help much.
Yeah.
And so I've just learned to approach those things with a little bit more of a calmness and a recognition that God is doing something that I may not be aware of, and I want to be in line with him. I don't want to try to make this all about me and my emotions and my feelings.
It's a lot easier to rail against injustice than it is to suffer for the good.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I do not, trust me, I don't relish suffering for the good ever.
No.
But I think that it is something that Christians we need to start wrapping our mind around, because at the end of the day, the United States provides us freedom from consequences. Mm-hmm. It provides us freedom from the consequences that come with exercising our convictions. If at some point we were to lose that, we still don't lose our Christian freedom, which is our freedom to obey. And that, to me, is the more crucial freedom that the church needs to hold on to. We are always free to obey.
We're so spoiled in this country, and I like it. I mean, I'm fine with it. But man, the Christians around the world, they get that. They get that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Last two questions. I think they should be pretty easy questions. Dr. James Spencer, what do you do if President Trump wins another term here coming up? How does your life change?
It doesn't that much, honestly. I'd love to think that maybe I'll have a little bit more spending money. But outside of that, there's really nothing that I'm going to be doing different. The day before the election, the day after the election are going to be pretty much the same for me.
And if Vice President Harris becomes the next president, how does your life change?
I think if that happens, the only way my life would change is I'll be writing some different op-ed pieces than I would ordinarily. But really, again, it doesn't change that much. I mean, I think the issues we need to address as a church, and this is something I would just say, no matter which candidate wins, the church needs to maintain a sufficient distance from our candidates that we can still critique them after the fact.
Yeah.
We've got to be able to speak theologically into our ruling parties, whoever they are. And so, I think the only difference would be which issues I'm addressing.
Yeah. I figured that'd be the answer, because it shouldn't drastically change our lives unless maybe your job is with one of the campaigns or the other. But that's
sure.
But as far as who we are in Christ, it doesn't matter who's in there. And I do have my preference, and I do think we should vote. But at the end of the day, I'm part of an internal kingdom, not.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yep. All right. Last word to you. How do we make it through the next couple of weeks and after, regardless of the outcome?
I'll kind of leave it with Augustine. I love the way Augustine talks about love of God and love of neighbor. And what he says is that we are to love God with an unqualified love. We leave nothing in the tank for anything else. And so all of our attention, all of our emotions, all of our focus is to be on our love for God.
Yeah.
And because we love God such like that, and we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves, our primary goal should be to get our neighbor to love God as well. And in doing so, everything that we do now is just sort of swallowed up in this current of love for God moving forward. If we can grasp that, I think the church becomes way more powerful than any other political entity. Mm-hmm. We just need to refocus on the first and the second greatest commandment and get them in the right order and continue to draw people into that love of God that is going to swallow up any other concerns, any other anxieties, and really drive our lives toward pointing to and glorifying the triune God.
And your happiness, your joy won't depend on whether your candidate wins or not, which is great news as well. I love it. All right, Dr. Smith, thank you so much. I love this conversation. I really like getting, keeping the main thing, getting back some balance to how we approach things, and remembering we need to love not just the people we like, but everybody, to love our enemies, right? And how do we do that well, regardless of the politics of it? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate you guys out there watching. If you want to share this with somebody, especially somebody who maybe just like, I can't wait for this political season to be over, just remember, who we are in Christ doesn't change. Doesn't matter who wins, who loses. But yet, at the same time, we have the freedom and privilege to go out and have some influence. So we should do that. Appreciate you guys being here. Check out the website, Useful to God. And we'll see you again next time here on Life Today Live.